Welcome to the platform of AfrONE. Thank you so much, AfrONE and the people of India and Nigeria, to have been given me a platform of literature, language, and of course, poetry. Let us today go back to the 17th century from the postmodern world. An intellectual way to ink poetry with life, altering questions, exploring the differences between the reality and perception. The metaphysical, indeed, played with words and wit. It is indeed a beautiful picture to talk about. Let's have a healthy discussion today. Yes, I have been noticing your questions. We would definitely discuss what metaphysical poetry is and go more deep into the characteristics rather than history, because history we all can read from the books. So, metaphysical poetry, the term metaphysical poetry was coined by Samuel Johnson. We all know that, right? And Samuel Johnson, he said that these poets yoked the heterogeneous ideas by violence together. Yes, indeed, their poetry, we would find them as obscure, difficult, as if they have joined and paired the diversified topics together forcefully. Right, the term metaphysical poetry, the metaphysics, right, has been derived from the term meta, beyond or after, physical, physica, physics, physical nature. All right, so the metaphysical poets, they explore the spiritual world beyond physical, and they talked about platonic love. The love is not mere physical, but they transcend that and they exceed and go beyond the physical world. So these 17th century poets, let's know about them: John Donne, George Herbert, Andrew Marvell, Richard Crashaw, Abraham Cowley, Henry Vaughan. Metaphysical poetry, I have just taken out few terms which we attribute to these poets or poetry: obscure, difficult, ethereal, supercilious, ingenious, odd, and bizarre. Yes, indeed, metaphysical poetry, when we read the poems, we find them, not clear. In the beginning, you will find it difficult to understand. For example, if we read the postmodern poetry, now we are more concerned towards micro poetry. We are breaking the rules of rhyme, rhythm, and they were the same. They didn't strict to the rules of rhyme, rhythm, meter. Yes, indeed, they used figures of speech and many imageries, conceits. We will discuss that later. All right, the poetry, we find it obscure, difficult, indeed, ethereal, very graceful. They are difficult to understand. Words are indeed heavy and beautiful yet graceful. So ethereal, supercilious, proud, arrogant, very direct. We'll find when we read the poems of John Donne and the other metaphysical poets, they were very proud of their poetry, and the pride could be seen easily in the verse. Ingenious, yes, creative, imaginative. They could go beyond the imaginary world and imagine to the depth of the spiritual world. They were original. You will not find any copy from or any idea from any other poetry of any other era. They were odd and bizarre, yes, unusual. They're strange. They do not match any other poems or poetry, right? So when we say the most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together, so Samuel Johnson, he played with these words because he termed a metaphysical poet and grouped the 17th century poets of England. All right, according to him, these poets, they were inclined to the personal and intellectual complexity. All right, and concentration is displayed in the poetry of John Donne. And John Donne, we regard that he is the chief of metaphysical poetry. So, I would use few notes to explain you so that you would understand better rather than my speech. So, there are common metaphysical questions, God. Does God exist? It's a question, isn't it? Unusual. We all believe in God, or we would to not, it is up to us. But the existence of God is a question to the metaphysical poets. They cover a broad range of topics from religious to consciousness. So, from religious to consciousness. Right? However, the questions of metaphysics, they generally ponder the nature of reality. This is very important for us to note, because they completely deal with the nature of reality, because they are more into spiritualism, they are philosophical. Alright? It is all about exploration and philosophy, not about science, and it's all about exploration of philosophy, isn't it? And it is not about science and math. No, they are beyond calculations, right? And if we now read the verses, or the poems of metaphysical poetry, they are very complex. No doubt they are very, intellectual. They are intellectual. Indeed, they are intellectual. For example, when you read the poem, The Valediction for Wedding Morning, John Donne compares two lovers' souls to a draftsman compass. And if they be two, they are two so, as if twin compasses are two. So John Donne is comparing the lovers to the compass, and we also find a dramatic, expression when we read John Donne and all the metaphysical poets. So metaphysical poets, they used conceits, they used imagery, they were more dramatic, and they were difficult to understand, because the languages, the language they used were very, very gigantic and beyond understandable by the common people. So we'll go to the characteristics. We'll learn more about the characteristics. So these the group of metaphysical poets, they are they are very, very we can say intellectual, and they used this. Wit is a very important term, all right? And they were witty too, and the humor was not very easy to understand. Humorous, but difficult to catch the humor of their poetry. So if we go to study the character, if we explore, we know the characters, but books will give you the characteristics, like they use imagery, the metaphysical poets use various figures of speech. But let us break the figures of speech and take out the real characteristics of metaphysical poems. They were, we can say, dramatic, all right? So when we study the characteristics of metaphysical poetry, they are dramatic, and the tone of speech was very, very direct. If you have read the poem, The Canonization, there is a dramatic starting. The beginning is abrupt yet dramatic. For God's sake, hold your tongue and let me love. So it is indeed dramatic, very straightforward, expressing love. So for God's sake, hold your tongue and let me love. Don't you find? the beginning, the starting of the poem to be too dramatic and too direct. Just, hold your tongue and let me laugh. Yes, I have been watching your queries on screen. Yeah. Yes, concentration is an important quality of metaphysical poetry. Concentration. You have to concentrate when you read metaphysical poetry, because metaphysical poems are not easy to understand. Right? And the readers, they are not they are held to one idea or line of argument. You'll find that they're very briefly and closely woven. For example, if you have read the poem Ecstasy, the principal argument is that the function of man as a man is being worthily performed through different acts of love. And he continues with the theme without digression, isn't it? So it's a question. And for example, as twixt two equal armies, fate suspends uncertain victory. Our souls hung twixt her and me. So the language is difficult, all right, and they are closely woven. The poems, the ideas are closely woven. So you need to pay attention and you need to concentrate while reading metaphysical poems. Yes, and expanded epigram. An expanded epigram. And this would be the best word to describe metaphysical poems. Nothing is described in detail. No word is wasted in metaphysical poems. So you find them direct, short, and the style is satiric, no doubt. We'll come to that point, all right? Though the verse forms are usually simple, all right, but you find a sense of force, sense of, something spiritual in the poems. For instance, moving the earth brings harms and fears. Men reckon what it did and meant. But trepidation of the spheres, though great afar, is innocent. So you find expanded epigram in the poetries, in the poems of, in the metaphysical poems. I have cold, so my voice is breaking. I hope you all are catching my words. I hope. Yes. All right. So when we speak about, expanded epigram, we find the tone to be satiric. Irony also fits in the poetry. All right. Nothing is described. I said nothing is described in detail, and not even a comma is wasted. There's a very strength in the style, right? So we'll take one or two poems of the metaphysical poets, and after discussing the characteristics and describe the satire in his poems. Yeah, conceits. They are fond of conceits. It's a major character of metaphysical poetry, and John Donne, he has used fantastic comparisons, all right, and I said the beginning is dramatic and direct, and that shows his fondness for conceits. So then he compares man to something, to some objects, all right, and see, it's a famous one. Everyone knows this. The most famous one used by Donne is a comparison of a man who travels and his beloved who stays at home to a pair of compasses in the poem. If you have read a valediction forbidding mourning, if they be two, they are two so, as stiff twin compasses are two. Right? The comparison. Just imagine. All right? And you are comparing two lovers to compasses. Again, another characteristic of metaphysical poem is wit. We find various allusions, images relating to, like, all areas of nature, art, learning, medicine, cosmology, contemporary discoveries, myth, history, law, and art. All right, these poets are fond of using wit. Again, if we read the poem The Ecstasy, then uses the belief of the blood containing certain spirits which acts as intermediary between the soul and body. As our blood labors to get spirits as like souls as it can, because such fingers need to knit. I do not remember the entire poem, and if you read the poem The Ecstasy, you'll come to know the use of wit in a better way. All right, and yes, in the same poem we find the use of astrology too. The intelligence, they the sphere. The intelligence, they the sphere. Now, if don't we find, if we read like these short and very short, graceful poems, we find that it is very much similar to the micro poetry we are trying these days. We are inking micro poetry where we are not following any rhyme scheme, we are not following any meters, right? So metaphysical poetry, again, it's a blend of passion and thoughts. It's a blend of passion and thought. Eliot, he thinks that passionate thinking is the chief idea or chief sign of metaphysical poetry. There is an intellectual analysis of emotion in dance poetry. So when we read dance poetry, we find an intellectual analysis. All right, every lyric, every line arises out of some emotional situation. All right, again, if we read a valediction, forbidding mourning, proves that lovers need not mourn at parting. Yes, lovers meet, but when you part, you need not mourn, you need not feel sad, right? So let us melt and make no noise, no tears, floods, nor sighs, tempest. Now, if we read about love, we definitely will come to this, metaphysical poetry, platonic love. Yes, indeed, platonic love. You see, platonic love. Platonic love is beyond physical, spiritual heights. They reach to the spiritual heights, right? And, platonic love is love more than you think it to be. If you remember these lines, I love these lines so much, so that I have written. So let us melt and make no noise, no tear floods, nor sighs tempest move. It were profanation of our joys to tell the lady our love. So deep love, we find deep love. All right, let us melt, but without making any noise. All right, let us show that we love each other. Let the world may not know about our love, but let us go deep, deep, deep into the love. More than physical, it's spiritual. All right. So, yes, if the lovers you part, you need not mourn. Again, when we read about platonic love and the love poetry, we also find the fusion of what we find, passionate feelings, and also logical arguments. All right, again, if you read the poem The Canonization, there is passion expressed through beautiful metaphors. Passion is expressed through metaphors. We compare, isn't it? Call us what you will, we are made such by love. Call her one, me another fly. We are tapers too, and at our own cost die. And we in us find the eagle and the dove. See, the lovers, they find in themselves one eagle and a dove. All right, the tone of the poem is, yes, indeed intellectual. All right, indeed we find the poem to be complex, but also we find, it's beautiful, full of allusions, the metaphor. Platonic love is indeed the most important feature of metaphysical poetry. It means spiritual love. Platonic love is spiritual love, free from the elements of physical love. And again, if we talk about passionate feelings, logical arguments, we also find metaphysical poetry to be a blend of sensual and spiritual, blend of sensual and spiritual experience. This characteristics, specifically it appears in dance poetry. If you read the canonization, the ecstasy, if you read, you find, for instance, and whilst our souls negotiate there, we like sepulchral statues lay, all day the same our postures were, and we said nothing all the day. We said nothing all the day. All day the same our postures were, and we said nothing all the day. Sensual, yet spiritual experience. All right. Yes, satire and irony characterizes metaphysical poetry. So, take you a course, get you a place, observe his honor or his grace. Again, if you read the poem, let me spell it if you canonization, if I am correct, you can check it. It's a long time I have read this poem, but still I remember. It speaks about the favored pursuits of people, the lust for wealth and favors. Lust for wealth and favors. So yes, you find satire and irony in the poems of metaphysical poets. And if we solely take John Donne, because he is the master of metaphysical poetry, and yes, his taste was indeed different and special. So if we speak only of Donne's poetry, we find the colloquial, speech. All right. This indeed, gives a special quality to metaphysical poetry, because colloquial, when you speak about, or when you talk about the term colloquial, so we find colloquial to be abrupt, isn't it? For God's sake, hold your tongue and let me love. It's so abrupt. All right. Or the king's real or his stamped face. All right. So indeed, if we solely speak about Donne's poetry, so colloquial speech really characterizes metaphysical poetry. And conversational openings are conversational. All right, nowadays we find micro poetry, the young generation, they are trying to ink micro poetry. So much to learn about metaphysical poets when we write micro poetry. Similarly, nowadays we are trying, yes, AfrONE, you people are writing micro poetry, isn't it? You are trying your hands on haiku, the Japanese style of writing poetry. It's 3 lines poetry, no rhyme, no rhythm. But just conversational, just abrupt, colloquial. So we have so much to learn from the metaphysical poets when we are inking micro poetry. So tomorrow, and yes, John, if you try micro poetry, give it a taste of metaphysical, metaphysical touch. Metaphysical poetry. Try it tomorrow. Let's see one of your poems. All right, we'll read one of your poems, and you need to give a touch of metaphysical characteristics. So I would really love to read. Now, yes, we have discussed so many things about metaphysical poetry, but one thing I genuinely find, I do not know, you may argue or many may argue, I find carelessness Carelessness and diction. I do not know why do I find, all right, they're just putting forth the words carelessly. And these poems, they actually reacted against the sweetness, the glowing sweetness and harmony of the Elizabethan poetry. They are not looking for harmony, they are not looking for sweetness, but yes, indeed, grace. All right, and they deliberately avoided and discarded conventional poetic expression. They were not conventional, they just fought against it. They tried something different. All right, and they employed very prosaic words, like just if they were scientists, they are very direct. All right, so yes, sometimes when we read their poems, we find as if they are so direct and obscure, difficult, because we find unpoetic words. We find unpoetic words. Rugged, we can say. Rugged is the word we can use. All right. So because their dictions are very straight, jerky, all right, coarse. And when we read them, when we don't find rhyme in it, but nowadays we have started loving the poems which really do not follow the conventional rules, because we are trying our hands on micro poetry and poetry without rhyme, without meter, without So we have to learn lots from the metaphysical poets. Hyperbolic, yes, this is again. Alright, they are direct, they are colloquial, they are obscure, they are difficult, but they use hyperbolic expression. Alright, and you really won't find natural grace in them. If you want to find some poetry, if you read the romantic poets, if you read the postmodern poets, all right, the poems today, you find love, emotion, and the beauty. You find natural grace, natural beauty. But here you have to find out the beauty, the intellectual writings. So you will not find natural grace in the metaphysical writing. All right, they would be abounding in artificiality of thought and hyperbolic expressions. All right, their thoughts would be highly intellectual. Their thoughts would be highly intellectual. So we can term it as artificial. Alright, artificiality of thought. Alright, and they blend with hyperbolic expression. Alright, and suddenly you will find that the writer, he's just speaking something unexpected and surprising. You do not expect. And when you read the poem, suddenly towards the end of the two lines, you will find that the writer is speaking something unexpected and surprising. So they endeavored to supply by hyperbole. Their amplifications had no limit, and they left not only reason but fancy behind them and produced combination of confused magnificence. For instance, again, if you read the poem A Valediction Forbidding Mourning, our two souls therefore, which are one, though I must go, endure not yet. Alright, so a bridge but an expansion, like gold to every thinness beat. If you read the poems, you'll find, as I'm now reading 4 lines of 4 lines of metaphysical poets, I do not find the rhythm to read the poems because they're so abrupt, they're so obscure, right? So the lyrics of the metaphysical poems are fantastic, peculiar. Peculiar is the word actually. It's a combination of 2 elements, fantastic form and incongruous in matter and manner. So when we find something incongruous and in matter and manner, although the lyrics are fantastic, while reading we have to pay attention. We need to concentrate. We cannot just read as a normal poem. We need to be intellectual to read metaphysical poetry. So much to know. Any questions? Yes, so much to know about metaphysical. It's metaphysical poetry. They do not end with just few explanations, and we need to explore more and more and more. And metaphysical poetry, again, why I have been comparing it to micro poetry, because I find like metaphysical poems to be very brief, concise. Every line conveys a lot of meanings in few words, isn't it? And I don't find any wastage of words, as I have wasted so many papers, but useful for you, right? And if you read all the metaphysical poets, you will find metaphysical poetry is a collection of maxims, sayings, quotes, and sayings. And Donne is the pioneer in this. If you read his poem, you find that his poems would contain maxims and sayings, as if you're reading quotes rather than poetry. Or is it visible to you? Alright. So Eliot, I remember Eliot says, like when I had read in the history, Eliot says that often the ideas are yoked but not united. Johnson said that Johnson said ideas are yoked, alright, forcefully. But Eliot says ideas are yoked but not united. Alright, and if we were to judge the styles of poetry, like you'll find, and Eliot says this, right? And according to Eliot, the language of these poets is as a rule simple and pure. Eliot says that metaphysical poems are very simple, very pure. So unlike the 18th century poems, the 17th century poems like Marvel's Coy Mistress and Crashaw's Saint Teresa, they are dissimilar in the use of syllables. In the former, there are short syllables to produce an effect of great speed, and in the latter, long syllables are used to effect an ecclesiastical solemnity. So, Eliot, in a sense, he criticized Johnson. He said he failed to define metaphysical by its faults. He said it's not correct. Not heterogeneous ideas are yoked together, forcefully. But he says that they are not yoked, but they are yoked but not united. Right? So one has to consider whether the metaphysical poetry has a virtue of permanent value or not. We do not know that metaphysical, poetry would be followed by today's generation or not. So again, Johnson's observation is that the attempts of these poets were always analytic. They were always analytic rather than poetic. Right? Again, Eliot says that in dramatic verse of the last Elizabethan and early Jacobean poets, there is a development of sensibility. For example, in Johnson, Chapson and Donne, there is a recreation of thought into feelings. That is the unification of sensibility. Right? So, despite all this, now it depends upon the postmodern poets, should we value metaphysical poets or not? Alright, do we use the characteristics of metaphysical poets, and do we find any taste today? Can we involve, or can we use such characteristics in today's micro poetry? Not even micro poetry, even if you write long poetry, can we go against the rules? They had gone against the rules. They did not follow any rhyme pattern, right? So now the question is that what the fate of metaphysical would have been if the current of poetry descended in a direct line from them. What do you think is the current fate, the current value of metaphysical poetry would be? Alright, but do we follow them? Do we still find the taste in them? It's a question to discuss, or it's an issue to discuss. It is not an issue. We really welcome still welcome the ideas of metaphysical poets. Alright, so because they were not only poets, they were philosophers, they were writers, they dealt with metaphysical questions, right? And So perhaps the most common characteristic is that metaphysical poetry contained large doses of wit. That is why we call them intellectuals, right? They question the existence of God, whether a human could possibly perceive the world or not, you know. And metaphysical poetry, also sought to shock the reader and wake him up from his normal existence in order to question the unquestionable. The poetry is often mixed, with ordinary speech, with paradoxes and puns. You use paradoxes, puns, and the results were very strange, such as, lovers are compared to compass, or the soul to a drop of dew. All right, and these concepts are called weird comparisons, and either weird or not, we are yet to, we are to decide. All right, and conceits were very far-fetched, sometimes absurd. So again, if you read William Shakespeare, sonnet number 130, he responded to the conventions of the Petrarchan conceit by negating them, particularly in the sonnet opening lines. When my mistress, I suppose if you read, my mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, then her breasts are done. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. See the comparison now. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why? Then her breasts are done. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I don't remember the entire poem, but again, if you read Shakespeare's sonnet, sonnet number 130, you will find this. So with the advent of romanticism, the concept fell into disfavor, because the romantics, they didn't use more of concepts, and they disfavored, along with the other poetic artifices. The metaphysical poets, they also used, imagery, all right. They used metaphors. So they generally, with the romantic poets, and in the late 19th century, again, it was revived by French. So by French symbolists, we'll discuss that later. But yes, with Romanticism, the metaphysical characteristics, the metaphysical idea of writing poetry, they generally, they were lost somewhere. They didn't, favor. So the metaphysical poets were men of learning, and they wanted to show their learning to the whole world, actually, and it was their whole endeavor. Unluckily, they never resolved to show it in rhyme. Instead of writing poetry, they only wrote verse. Now they only wrote verse. They termed their poetry as verse, not poetry. That is why colloquial. Alright, they only wrote verses, and their verses stood the trial of the finger better than the ear. They used to write. Alright, modulation was was not perfect. They are imperfect. So when you stand to recite metaphysical poems, it is very difficult. They are very difficult to recite, because you do not find the rhythm in it, because there are no rhymes. Alright, and that they were only found to be verses by counting the syllables. That is why Samuel Johnson said the most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together. He used violence. So ideas are paired by violence, forcefully. Alright, nature and art are ransacked for illustrations, comparisons, allusions. They used to compare a lot. Alright, we find lots of illustrations. Yes, comparisons. We find comparisons. All right, and the reader commonly thinks his improvement dearly bought, and though he sometimes, the reader keeps on wondering if without concentration. So the term metaphysics in poetry is the fruit of Renaissance tree. So, becoming overripe and approaching pure science. Hope, you could grasp what metaphysical poetry is. We have more to discuss. We can discuss more on it, because there is no end to discuss poetry and a specific type of poetry, isn't it? So here we have come to the end of the discussion today. You can come up with your questions. I can see your questions. Yeah, yes. I just wanted to show everyone, the discussion, because Skype is not working properly in Nigeria. Although you all are wonderful people to discuss poetry, language, literature, I never knew I would really find, wonderful people from Nigeria who discuss on poetry, language, literature. And thank you, AfrONE. You are really doing wonders. Today I took the help of, papers and pencil and colors, because I thought of, making the class something interesting, isn't it? So I thought, yes, I'm getting your messages. Yeah. Yes, poetry is often mixed with paradoxes and puns. I have said that. You find paradoxes and puns, and so the results are very strange. And they used to compare unlikely things. I saw lovers to a compass, the soul to a drop of dew. Isn't it? The comparisons, when we discussed conceits. Yes. Now, if you again come to, you need to know the meaning as poets. You need to know the meaning, what is paradox, what does paradoxes. And paradoxes are, opposite statements. Opposite, or you can say contradictory statements. So, when you read Donne's poetry or all the metaphysical poets, you find the poems full of paradoxes. If you take out now puns, what are puns? Puns are also called paronomasia. It's a form of wordplay. So you exploit multiple meanings of a term, all right, and you find paradoxes and pun in the poetry, in the metaphysical poems, all right. And ambiguities can arise from you find homographic use, metonymic use, all figurative languages. Yes. Any more questions? Yes. Wonderful, wonderful. If you try your hands, your pen, to write micro poetry using the characteristics of metaphysical poetry, that can be that can be a new idea, that can be a new innovative way of writing poetry. Why can't we can do it. We can try using the characteristics of metaphysical poetry and put them in the present postmodern poetry. Whether you write whatever you write, whether you write a romantic poem, or you write a poem on nature, or you relate history. So so you can if you can touch metaphysics, you have to transcend above or beyond the physical and concrete. All right, it is all about non-material and supernatural things, isn't it? So the age object it's objects where it objects to the simplification. All right, but again it's a product of popularization of the study of mental phenomena. You have to keep in yes, psychology is a good term if we associate with metaphysical poetry. Yes. It doesn't contain sensual things explicitly, all right, because I have been telling you it is more than physical, more than sensual. Although you find the sensuous objects in the poems of metaphysical poetry, they are beyond the physical, all right. And yes, what is true of his mind is true in different terms. Yeah, they are intellectually rigorous. They were subtle. The poetry is subtle. You can use the word subtle. Alright. And you also find argumentative. If you take out the poems of Donne and other poets, you find argumentative because they use logic. They use logic. Dramatic, of course. I have told you in the beginning. Dramatic. Alright. Because the opening itself is abrupt. Style, if we again speak about the style, style is very concise, alright, and they are really focused on concepts, alright. So they compare the unusual, the usual to unusual, unusual to usual, and unexpected things or images, and they use extended metaphors. So Donne resolves everything into a unity, the oneness of lovers, the self-sufficiency of lovers, the images of the circle, cycles, perfection. Marvel and like other metaphysical poet, they do not attempt to resolve the dialectics of the polarities. Rather, he ends them in a compromise. Marvel compromises, all right. And all metaphysical poets attempt to transcend the physical sphere. So if we again come all metaphysical poets, their basic attempt is to this is the very key word, transcend the physical sphere. Why? So that they can gain perspective or vision. They wanted to gain vision, alright. And metaphysical poets, they attempt to explain the emotional and spiritual elements of life in concrete. So they attempted spiritual and emotional elements of life, all right, in rational and logical terms. Yes, they were rational, logical, right. So, and Donne, if you read Donne, he uses religious concepts too. So yes, Donne used a great deal of specialized knowledge in this poetry. And yes, today we come to the end of this discussion. And yes, you all are live on WhatsApp too. You will keep pouring your questions tonight so that I can keep on answering. Alright, I am available till 10 p.m. So we come to the end of today's discussion. Metaphysical poetry, philosophical, spiritual, they are obscure, difficult, ethereal, supercilious, ingenious, odd, bizarre, yet graceful, beautiful. And let's try to use some of the characteristics of metaphysical poetry to the postmodern, with the postmodern, in the postmodern poems. And let's try micro poetry tomorrow with metaphysical characteristics. Thank you so much, AfrONE. Thank you so much, the learners and the literature lovers of India, Nigeria, and whosoever is watching this video, would be watching this video, because now I'm live only with AfrONE. Thank you, John. Thank you, the people of Nigeria and India. Thank you so much.